whole, and that it would be almost impossible to separate the management of the two. So even though that's a long way of saying that it is not only a goal to keep the two of them together, it seems to be almost an administrative impossibility to separate them.
Well, actually, that was followed by something that is really a bit of an insider's question. Will the flea market be reinstituted?
You answer that.
I can tell you right now that if we are the successful owners of the property, you bet your bippy. Since CW Capital doesn't own all the debt, can junior debt owners still sue, similar to Pershing Square?
The answer is they could. One of CW, by keeping in place the ownership structure that we talked about earlier, namely Tishman Speyer still owning the equity, CW Capital controlling the senior mezzanine debt, but the junior mezzanine debt holders all remaining out there and in place, and CW Capital, owning and control, don't own, but basically controlling and managing the mortgage debt. There is always a risk that one of the junior mezzanine holders could step up and sue. And I think that when CW considers precisely how it will end up conveying title to the property to the third party, or in other words, effectuating the title transfer, that would be the condominium conversion, they are going to have to think about how they do that in a way that both is most effective in terms of transfer tax, allows them to do some restructuring of debt if that's how the purchase price ends up being paid for the property, and also minimizes the risk of those junior mezzanine holders who are still out there coming in and suing and challenging.
But anything could happen, right? I mean, it seems like CW has the ball and has come up with a strategy that can work, but in the world of legal challenges, there's all kinds of lawyers out there willing to get hired and bring things. So we shouldn't be overly copacetic that there will be a linear path here. That it's always possible someone brings a lawsuit to try to change things. But we're hopeful and I think cautiously optimistic that the value proposition to do that is so great, meaning how far down if you think the property is worth $1.9 billion today, you're really ascribing a value at that level of $3.5, close to $4 billion. That wouldn't be a good use of someone's money to do that.
This has been somewhat addressed before, but I kind of think it's worth hearing again. Now that CW Capital is in control, what assurances do we have that it will move forward with its stated desire to work with the TA on an ownership plan?
They've sent us a letter. They have. There's no contract. There's no written agreement between us and them. People can always, renege on what they've said. I think one of the things that we all collectively have going for us is the strong political support that this tenants association and these efforts have behind it. And it would seem to me that CW would be crazy to risk going up against all the various political leaders that you have behind you here and to do something that was hostile with the tenants. It just would seem crazy. So as long as we are aligned with the political leaders that you have gotten to rally behind your cause, I would think that CW would think more than twice before doing something like that.
I would only add that while it is correct that there is no binding nature of their communication to the Tenants Association, it is an indication which they did not need to make, but did make. They do have an interest that is tied to their own economics, which involves partnership with the tenants, which is unusual for us in that the folks on the other side of the table have a direct financial interest that involves finding ways to partner with the tenants. And I think that Bill is absolutely correct. CW must deal fairly with this community, or the folks on this stage are going to be extremely vocal as we have been, and that's fundamental, that they are upfront and open, and that they work cooperatively with this tenants association.
What happens in 2017 when J51 expires? If you weren't given a J51 rider when you first leased an apartment, is your apartment rent stabilized until you move out? In 2000, I had a rent stabilized lease. I was deregulated in 2007. I didn't receive a rider until this year with the new lease.
What the statute provides is that in order for a landlord to deregulate an apartment at the time the J51 benefits expire, that landlord must have given the required J51 notice in the original lease and every renewal lease for every tenant. So if a tenant did not receive that notice, under very clear terms of the statute, that tenant is entitled to remain rent stabilized until that tenant vacates the apartment. It may be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later, that tenant is entitled to remain rent stabilized. The only tenants that can be deregulated at the expiration of their then current lease are those that receive the rider throughout the period of their tenancy. There is an issue as to the applicability of those provisions to apartments that were wrongly deregulated and were for a period market apartments, and then were subsequently re-regulated under the Roberts decision. There has been a recent court ruling in a case called IPN, or Independence Plaza North, where the judge came out very clearly and said, well, if the landlord didn't give the required notice, it doesn't matter if these apartments were wrongly deregulated. The landlord was represented by some of the best legal counsel in the business, and they should have hedged their bets, and they should have given the required notice, and therefore that judge ruled in that case that apartments that did not receive the notice would remain regulated until the tenants vacated the property. That's a lower court ruling. The issue is going up on appeal, and it will be resolved one day by probably the Court of Appeals, but the current status of the law is in favor of the tenants on that question.
My family and I live in a one-bedroom rent-stabilized apartment. Would we be able to buy a two-bedroom, or could we only purchase our present apartment?
We would make as much effort as possible in designing a plan to give the residents of the complex the opportunity to purchase vacant apartments so that they could get the apartment they wanted. Obviously, you don't have first choice to purchase an occupied apartment that's occupied by one of your neighbors. But certainly we would work to try to make the vacant apartments available so that people could do a switch in purchasing.
Who are the people behind CW Capital? Who owns CW Capital? How much did they end up paying for Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village?
CW Capital is a corporation that, which what the C and W stands for, if you remember, Alex, but it was owned by a Canadian investment firm and was recently sold to a large fund manager, Fortress Investments. They're in the business of this role, which is called the special servicer role of CMBS vehicles. And those of you who didn't attend the Finance Committee sessions, we could spend time at another meeting going back through CMBS, but they do that. They also invest capital into real estate deals and manage other funds. It's just it's a financial institution that you've never heard of before and never wanted to hear of before until they came into this situation. But There are many others that do this. Midland, L&R, Wachovia has an arm that does this. They're somewhat of a faceless institution in the sense that someone you don't see on the street corner. Alex?
Yeah, the CW goes back to the firm's legacy predecessor known as Continental Wingate. They have been active in and around the commercial real estate market since the 1980s. One of the additional roles they perform is a component of the commercial real estate capital markets. They are what's known as a DUS lender, or a designated underwriter and servicer for multifamily loans that are subsequently delivered to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So they are, in fact, a reputable, well-run organization. As Bill mentioned, they were recently sold, or the interest in them was sold by the Caisse de Depot in Canada, and they are now majority owned by Fortress Investment Group here in New York.
Thank you. Now, Michael, this is
may I say a little bit about Fortress? I want to say that Fortress originally, as I understand it, had the mezzanine, and then they were bought out of that, and then they're part of the holding company that bought CW. Is that correct with Fortress?
That's right. Fortress bought the interest in CW that had previously been owned by Caisse de Depot.
Okay. Fortress, if you remember during the Katrina scandal, was the firm that went down to Louisiana and was evicting people from their homes. And it was the firm that Edwards held a stake in and immediately resigned from running for president with the scandals related to it. I just wanted to share that with you, that we have to be very careful watching that particular firm.
Thank you. And what did CW Capital end up paying?
CW Capital didn't really pay anything for this project. They were the special servicer for the $3 billion of first mortgage financing that was part of the $5.4 billion acquisition completed by Tishman Speyer and BlackRock.
Here's how I think about it: is that think of CW as if all of you guys got together and decided to pool your money to buy something for $100 million or $10 million or whatever it was. But none of you wanted to actually have the decision-making role of how the lending was managed. You would hire an agent for you to do that. And you may have some voting provisions that allows you to indicate to the agent what you want to do. Think of CW like that. CW doesn't have an economic stake directly in lending money to these projects, to these properties, or anything like that. They are hired, like many other ones, L&R and Midland, to simply manage the financial interests of the investors who put the money in. And so that's one of the reasons when we talk about the fiduciary duty that CW has. They are often between a rock and a hard place between trying to do the quick thing and kind of get the headache gone, and the challenge of trying to maximize the recoveries out of any one of these properties. And they don't just have Stuytown, or just Peter Cooper Village. CW has mortgages on probably gas stations and places, and all across the country, all kinds of things like this they're dealing with. This is clearly their largest situation they're dealing with, but they're not a lender. They didn't pay for the loans. This is all the result of the securitization kind of on steroids that happened in the middle 2000s, where people were lending money without necessarily directly inspecting or managing the investments.
We're actually past our 3:30 time, but I'm going to forge ahead with just a few more questions. Michael, this question was in an odd way optimistic. And it's, can I go to bed tonight assured that I will remain as a rent-stabilized tenant? And what is Mayor Bloomberg's position?
Again, as Brian Kavanaugh said, and as I said, that we will never be in a position